Welcome. I'm Peggy Hill. So the San Francisco Opera Guild, the Bay Area chapters of the Guild, and the Previews Committee welcome you to our first preview of San Francisco Opera's summer season. We're all looking forward to hearing a preview of the rarely performed opera, Richard Strauss's Die Frau ohne Schatten. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Simon Williams, or Professor Simon Williams. He's an emeritus professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an active director of both opera and spoken drama. And he's internationally recognized as an authority on the history of acting and Shakespearean performance, on opera as drama, and on the history of operatic staging. He has lectured worldwide on Wagner, served for several years as a lecturer for English-speaking audience at the Bayreuth Festival, and has spoken on a wide range of operas at both opera houses and opera guilds worldwide. He is a principal speaker at the annual and exciting Opera at Oakhurst weekend in the California Sierras, and he's authored 4 books on German theater, 2 of them on Wagner, as well as also serving as co-editor of the first English language history of German theater and chief editor of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Stage Actors and Acting. Wow. So we're certainly looking forward to hearing the preview of this seldom performed opera. Please ask questions, look down, and you see the button for Q&A. That's where you can put your questions in for Professor Williams to answer at the end of this speech, or the preview, excuse me. And with that, I'm welcoming in Professor Simon Williams. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, and it's a delight to be here. So, Die Frau ohne Schatten. For those of you who have not seen Die Frau ohne Schatten, you're in for a tremendous treat. Die Frau ohne Schatten is one of the most sort of fascinating operas ever written. Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal's opera, Die Frau ohne Schatten, is actually seen a little bit more frequently now than it used to be, but it's an opera that's very difficult to do. For a start, it's scored for 164 instruments and has extremely elaborate orchestration. Secondly, it requires 5 leading soloists in very, very testing roles, in some ways as testing as anything in Wagner. And there are many secondary roles that, however short they are, require voices of extremely highly trained technique. It's an incredibly complex production, and in fact is beyond the capacity of most opera houses, certainly if most of Hofmannsthal's stage directions are to be followed. It has an exotic and obscure symbolism that people often have difficulty with. But to sort of crown it all, it has some of the most beautiful music ever written for an opera house. Now, to be quite honest, Die Frau ohne Schatten was not a tremendous hit when it was first produced at the Vienna State Opera in 1919. The score was very difficult for people to grasp on first hearing. The symbolism was considered to be arcane, and many people felt unnecessary. The audience also had difficulty in following the plot. And also, for some, Die Frau ohne Schatten sounded a little bit out of date. And it looked as if the opera actually was bound for obscurity. And it really was not done that much during Strauss's lifetime. But a few decades later, specifically since the Second World War, something remarkable happened. Die Frau ohne Schatten began to achieve considerable popularity. From the 1960s on, it found increasingly interested audiences. I can remember I was lucky enough to be a student in London when it was first performed at the Royal Opera House, and I can remember being quite amazed and bowled over by what was such a striking score, and also a very, very interesting production. Now, in fact, it's probably not quite as rare as some of the publicity will tell us. In fact, it is now the 5th most frequently performed of all of Richard Strauss's operas. In fact, it is more frequently performed than either Arabella or Capriccio. And I hope that why this is, and why it is now popular, is something that might become clear over the next hour as I'm talking. Now, a word about the creators. Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal is one of the most celebrated couplings of composer and librettist in opera history, equivalent to Da Ponte and Mozart and Verdi and Boito. Now, both Strauss and Hofmannsthal had been Wunderkinder when they were young. In the 1890s, Hofmannsthal was a very celebrated poet. Even though he was only a teenager, he wrote some of the most striking symbolist poems. Strauss, who was a little bit older, in fact, during the 1890s, was a very vigorous, flashy, experimental composer of orchestral poems. Some of you might be quite familiar with these, with Don Juan of 1888, Death and Transfiguration, 1899, Till Eulenspiegel, 1895, Also sprach Zarathustra, 1896, Ein Heldenleben, 1898, and there indeed are quite a few other tone poems he wrote at this time. These works were noted for their inventive orchestration. They were sensationalistic. They displayed a very virtuosic technique, and also they used the orchestra to tell a narrative. Essentially, these were musical stories. They were very controversial, but they were very popular. And it was quite natural, actually, that a composer of his tendencies would turn to opera. And after 2 minor operas, he then hit the big time with one of his most successful works, and that is Salome. And here we can see two pictures of Salome, the shocking scene where Salome embraces the head of John the Baptist, first in the first Dresden performance in 1904, and then in London in 2020. Salome was a potent mix of sex, religion, and violence. It shocked the conservatives, but was extremely popular with audiences. There are many tales of attempting to censor the opera, but the notable feature of Salome, and it's a feature that I think really has kept it in the repertoire ever since, is it combined passages of deeply romantic longing with outbursts of quite horrendous barbarism. It's a work of astonishing contrasts. And in a good production today, it can still offend audiences. This, of course, strengthened tremendously Strauss's reputation as the bad boy of German music. The libretto, by the way, is based upon Oscar Wilde's play. Now, Strauss's next opera was based upon a play written by Hofmannsthal, Electra. In fact, this was adapted from the Sophocles play. And Electra, in Electra, there's a similar brew. It's not quite as sensational as Salome was, but it does have the same mixture of romantic longing and violence. And Electra, in particular, is a study of pathological disturbance. Hofmannsthal loved Strauss's version of his play, and it was then that he decided that he was going to devote a lot of his remaining time to collaborating with Strauss. And of course, he actually served as quite a moderating influence on Strauss. Their first collaboration was Der Rosenkavalier, that was first performed in Dresden in 1910, and I'm sure it's an opera that several of you are quite familiar with today. It's a glorious evocation of 18th century Vienna during the reign of Maria Theresa. It's not historically accurate. For example, there is no record of the ceremony of the presentation of the rose, which is an essential event in the opera. This actually was a fictional creation by Hofmannsthal himself. Der Rosenkavalier was immensely popular, a gilded representation of everyone's ideas of Vienna. And in Der Rosenkavalier as well, you have these strong contrast between the ethereal music of love and the pathos of growing old, and then the low comedy of country relatives. So in this mixture of pathos and romance on the one hand, and low comedy on the other, one has the familiar sort of clashes that were associated with Strauss's music. The libretto was extremely wordy, very complex, and in fact, at one point, Strauss even set the stage directions to work because he wasn't quite sure whether they were actually part of the dialogue or actually stage directions. But anyway, the libretto has aroused as much interest as the music, which is quite a feat. And then this was followed by Ariadne auf Naxos, of which there are two versions. The first done in Stuttgart in 1912 and the next in Vienna in 1916. And this is an opera about the mixing of the tragic and the comic genre. Strauss, by the time we get to Ariadne, was far from the sensationalism of his earlier operas, and he recreated the illusion of an 18th century world. And the opera itself is little concerned with the political, spiritual, and even emotional problems of Europe in the early 20th century, though these had clearly been reflected in the earlier operas Electra and Salome. Now, the First World War ended in November 18th, and Vienna, like all the rest of Central Europe, was in ruins. Millions were flung into poverty. Vienna became a wasteland. Of course, 4 major empires had fallen in Europe by the end of the First World War: Russia, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Monarchies had been replaced by republics. The demands of the states for independence grew very, very strongly, which led even more quickly to the dissolution of the traditional empires. And the seeming unity of Europe was shattered. Now, it was during this period that Die Frau, ohne Schatten was written. At the same time that Hofmannsthal and Strauss were working on it, they were also collaborating with the great German director, Max Reinhardt, this gentleman here. They were collaborating with Max Reinhardt to plan a major artistic event. And that event would be the Salzburg Festival. Excuse me, I have just gone over a little bit. I'll just leave that as it is for the moment. They planned a major event, the Salzburg Festival, Of course, the Salzburg Festival is now the most prestigious of all opera and music drama festivals in Europe. The founders actually had hoped that the Salzburg Festival would be very popular. But of course, today it has become really quite an elitist institution, even though many people who are working it try very earnestly to try to sort of spread the appeal of the work. But in the late 1910s and in the 1920s, with Europe in smithereens, what Hofmannsthal, Reinhardt, and Strauss hoped to do would be to create a common sense of identity among all peoples, and to create this common sense not through politics, not through war, but through the arts. The founders were motivated by pan-human ideals. They focused for much of the festival on the art of the past, and they tried to lead the audience to understand the past and to understand how through the arts we can all come to feel the commonness of our roots. They aspired actually to reach beyond Europe to the great performance and artistic cultures of other countries. This certainly was Hofmannsthal's ambition as a writer, and he had no difficulty in persuading both Strauss and Max Reinhardt to agree with it. In fact, essentially, the Salzburg Festival was Hofmannsthal's artistic agenda writ large, and I think also it actually is the agenda of Die Frau, ohne Schatten written large as well. Now, Die Frau, ohne Schatten. No other opera in the Strauss-Hofmannsthal collaboration demonstrates the ideals of internationalism, of an attempt to create compassion between peoples, quite as completely and clearly as Die Frau, ohne Schatten. It's based on multiple sources. The initial idea came from a very obscure short story by a minor romantic writer, Wilhelm Hauff, called Heart of Stone. But then another important source was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Conversations with German Immigrants, which in fact he had published in 1795. There are other sources, in particular the Arabian Nights, Grimm's fairy tales, Goethe's Faust, and Mozart's The Magic Flute. In fact, Hofmannsthal himself referred to Die Frau, ohne Schatten as our magic flute. He felt that it was the sort of the landscape, the spiritual landscape of the magic flute was the closest to the landscape that he and Strauss were trying to create in Die Frau, ohne Schatten. Now, in addition to these sources from a sort of a fairly broad spectrum, added to this were effects taken from East Asian theater. Asian instruments were included in the orchestra. There were chimes, bells, gongs. And this internationalism and mix of periods was very much within the purpose of the creators of Die Frau, ohne Schatten, to create a world that combines variety, that combines opposites, that binds people together by their sense of a common origin and by their sense of compassion for each other. In many ways, actually, the message of Die Frau, ohne Schatten is not far from that of the message of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. In other words, that it is compassion that must become the guiding force in our world. And like the Ring, Die Frau, ohne Schatten has music that overwhelms us. Now, as a lot of us are probably not too familiar with Die Frau, ohne Schatten, I should just give a sort of a fairly quick summary of the plot. You will find that a number of people will say, oh, Die Frau, ohne Schatten the plot is far too complicated. It's not far too difficult to follow. Do not believe a word they say. In actuality, the plot of Die Frau, ohne Schatten is really quite simple. It's a fairy tale, and it has the simplicity of a fairy tale. What the main reason why people do find it difficult is that, in fact, the production is created with, has so much spectacle in it and so much ritual that at times you might lose the story. Anyway, let me try to account for this story as simply as I can. First, it is set in mythical times in a realm called the Southeastern Islands. And there are two levels of action. There is the level of the spirit world, and there is the level of Earth, where struggling humanity lives. The spirit world is ruled over by a god called Kaikobad, who never appears, but actually you feel him as a presence throughout so much of the opera. Now, before the action actually starts, the emperor of the Seven Isles, who sort of exists, as it were, between the spirit world and the earth, the emperor of the Isles has been hunting. And while he was hunting, he shot a white gazelle, and he grazed the neck of the gazelle. And the moment this happened, it turned into a beautiful young woman who actually turns out to be Kaikobad's daughter. The emperor falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him. And so she is married. They are married. But when she is married, something unfortunate happens. She loses her magic powers, and also she loses her shadow, which means in the symbolism of traditional fairy tales, she is not fully human and crucially cannot have children. So the emperor and empress have all the joys of a marvelous love life at night, but there seems to be no children coming from it. A day the emperor goes hunting. Now, at the start of the opera, Kaikobad sends his spirit messenger to visit with his daughter. And the spirit messenger is met not by the daughter, but by the nurse, which is the empress's companion. She has brought her up since she was a child. And the nurse and the messenger says to the nurse that in the next 3 days, the empress must acquire a shadow. In other words, she must become human, or the emperor, her husband, will turn to stone, which of course is a metaphor for dying. The nurse is greatly alarmed by this. She persuades the empress to descend to earth with her, and when she gets to earth, they will be able to acquire a shadow from somebody who lives in earth. And they descend to earth in a very clattery orchestral interlude, and they eventually end up in the house of Barak, who is an impoverished dyer, and his wife, the dyer's wife. Now, Dyer and his wife, Barak and his wife live in squalor. Their marriage is failing. They have no children. The dyer's wife is deeply, pathologically unhappy. And the nurse determines that they should go for her shadow, and they should steal her shadow and give it to the empress. So we have two parallel couples. On the one hand, we have the emperor and the empress, who are sexually active, but barren and detached from humanity, and Barak and his wife, who are sexually dead and also barren, a symbol of suffering humanity. They live almost in a form of hell. Now, in the second part of Act 1, and in all of Act 2, they're composed basically of 3 visits that the nurse and the empress pay to Barak and his wife on each of the 3 days. And in each of these visits, they bring servants. And these servants offer the dyer's wife all sorts of delight, sex, exotic food, glamorous costumes, extravagant entertainment. And the dyer's wife, who is sort of living in bitterness and poverty, is so impressed by this that she gradually succumbs to them and is prepared to sell her shadow to the nurse and the empress, that they will have the shadow and she, the dyer's wife, can go and live this life of luxury that they have presented to her. However, as the action proceeds and she becomes more and more tempted to, in fact, sort of to sell her shadow, at the same time, she is split because she still has some sort of spark of love for her husband. But however, her husband also infuriates her. And so finally, in anger, she tells Barak that she has been unfaithful to him. At this point, Barak and his brothers see that she has no shadow. And the moment they say she has no shadow, there's a gigantic earthquake that swallows Barak and his wife, and the nurse and the empress disappear to the spirit world again. Now, while all this has been going on, the emperor has come to think that his wife has been unfaithful because he sees her outside their house when she told him that she always stayed inside. And as a result, thinking his marriage is over, he goes towards into a spiritual realm where he will die, turned to stone. The final act of the opera resolves this situation. Barak's wife learns compassion for her husband. She admits to him she lied, and she says she was not unfaithful. Then, in a long, beautiful sequence, the empress is taken to the isle where her husband is now encased in stone. And Kaikobad's spirit comes and tells her that if she takes the dyer's wife's shadow, the emperor will be released from stone and their marriage will continue. The empress is in torment. She wants her husband, but she has been so filled by compassion for Barak and also for his wife. She has been so horrified by their suffering that she feels she cannot destroy their marriage by taking her shadow. She refuses. The most powerful line in the whole opera is, Ich will nicht, I will not. And the moment she does this, she's given her own shadow. Wonderful moment on the stage as the light comes down, this great shadow of her develops. She has actually become human, as she has acted out of compassion for another human being. And the opera ends with the two couples united and happy, celebrating their unions. Now, at heart, we might just say this is a domestic comedy, a communal garden trade of the stage. But the whole action is provided with the most elaborate fairy tale apparatus. There are choruses of spirits, ghostly apparitions, ornate masks, thunder and lightning. If all stage directions are followed, you have to have a constant change of sets. And there's a score that, like Strauss's previous operas, swings from sumptuous romantic music to passages of feral violence. I want to explore some of these features now, but don't worry if you can't understand everything right away, particularly the symbolism. Just let it sink in and enjoy the music, and then worry afterwards about what the symbolism might mean. If you follow the basic plot, actually, you will enjoy the opera greatly. As I said, I first saw Die Frau ohne Schatten in London in the 1960s, and I've also spoken on it on one or two occasions. And I still feel I don't fully understand the meaning of the falcon, the gazette, and the elaborate rituals that take up a lot of Act 3. But I'm glad I don't, because every time I go to see it, they add mystery to a familiar opera, and they challenge me to try to reinterpret it. Now, today's economic restraints and minimalist tastes mean that productions of Die Frau ohne Schatten are not as spectacular as once they were. Here we have got the set designs for the first performance in Vienna in 1919 by the great artist Alfred Roller. Nowadays, we did have a sort of a period of fairly realistic productions of Die Frau ohne Schatten, but nowadays sets tend to be a little bit more abstract. Here we actually have the set designs by David Hockney in the production that you're going to see. I have seen this production twice, and I can tell you it has there's a wonderful sort of spectacular energy to it. Now, and the third way in which it's done, of course, today in Europe, it's often done in an extremely realistic or even grotesque way. Here we have shots from production in Vienna, and here another one from Frankfurt. Now, there are, unfortunately, very few good DVD recordings of Die Frau ohne Schatten. I'm going to use the best, but I must admit I was a little bit surprised when I came to that decision that this was the best. This production that we're going to be looking at extracts from was actually first performed at the Salzburg Festival in 2011. The orchestra playing is the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, and it displays the astonishing orchestration of the opera remarkably well. The singing is tremendously accomplished. The conductor is Christian Thielemann, who is himself one of the world's leading Straussians. Musically, it is powerful and moving. The production is by Christoph Loy. And I was first disappointed when I read reviews of this saying that this was such a sort of a marvelous work in terms of the music, but that it was actually a bit of a dud as a production, because it was not actually a production that did the whole of the spectacle of Die Frau ohne Schatten in a sort of a realistic style way. Instead, it is actually set in the Sophian Saal, which is a big hall in Vienna. And now this is not the hall itself. This is actually what was seen on the stage at the Salzburg Festspielhaus. And the performance itself is not actually a performance of a complete produced performance of Die Frau ohne Schatten, but an attempt to reconstruct, or maybe not quite so much reconstruct, but take as a base the occasion when Die Frau ohne Schatten was first recorded in Vienna. This was in 1955. It was winter. It was cold. Vienna was still close to starvation. There was no heat. The singers came in and they all were dressed in winter clothes. Furthermore, they sang for free. I thought when I was reading about this that choosing this setting was a sad missed opportunity. But I bought the DVD anyway because none of the previous DVDs seemed to me to be satisfactory. And the one that I was going to use, actually, my laptop would no longer actually play the soundtrack. But I put this on to look at it, and I was absolutely transformed by it. It was actually the opposite of being a disappointment. The performance brilliantly highlighted the psychological conflicts of the characters, allowing one to focus on the music and the drama and discovering the most profoundly moving moments in the developing dramatic relationship. And now what I would like to do is just show you some of the real strengths of the opera through this rather strange, but I think ultimately very rewarding performance. The orchestra. Now the orchestra is built. You can see the prompt box at the bottom of the screen there, and the orchestra, of course, is in the sort of the orchestra pit below it. The orchestra in Die Frau ohne Schatten is noted for its size and variety, though very rarely do all the instruments play together. When they do, it's a mighty racket, I can assure you. And in fact, when they do play together, it tends to signify catastrophe in the action. As a general rule, the music that depicts the spirit world, where the empress comes from and which the emperor half lives in, the music for the spirit world tends to be chamber-like. Solo instruments are prominent. There's a penetrating poetry to it. Then when we go down to earth, the music is heavier. There are more instruments. There is a considerable amount of dissonance in the orchestra. In other words, Strauss is still sort of practicing some of those musical sort of techniques that brought him considerable fame and some notoriety when he was a younger man. But there's a sustained clash in the opera between the music of love and the music of violence, between serenity of mind and deep unhappiness. And it is that gap between these poles that is the real sort of cauldron in which Die Frau ohne Schatten develops. A good example of this comes from Act 1. The nurse and the empress have arrived in the hovel where the dyer lives for the first time, and they tempt the dyer's wife with gaudy apparitions that awaken both her greed and carnal desires. It's actually one of the most spectacular scenes in the opera, and I can assure you in the Hockney production, they do a great job with it. The nurse, during this whole sort of event that's going on, she summons up the vision of a beautiful young man and opulent oriental surroundings, and the women in the chorus are the spirits. This is how the scene is performed in this particular setting. Well, I hope you have some idea of the rather strange sort of mix we have here of a sort of a formal situation of recording with people at their sort of their desks and with the music stands, and yet at the same time they're beginning to sort of enact the drama itself. And indeed, as that goes on, the drama becomes very clear, and the pain of the relationship between the characters becomes overwhelming. You should note the Empress, who was that sort of quiet lady sitting at the side, eventually she comes on and offers the mirror to the dyer's wife. The Empress is a figure of serenity in contrast to the hysterical wife and the cruelly ironic nurse. And as the action of the Frau, ohne Schatten develops over the entire span of the action, she becomes the dominant figure in the action. And she eventually becomes, of course, she is the main character. She is the woman without a shadow. And what she learns in the course of the action becomes the message that we learn too, that compassion and love are more powerful and fulfilling than just I beg your pardon, more powerful than just fulfilling one's own selfish needs, which, as I said, is the central theme of Wagner's Ring as well. And several of you who are familiar with Strauss will have heard echoes of other Strauss operas in the score, Elektra for the jarring sounds and the sense of apocalypse, the Der Rosenkavalier for the lush melodies, and Ariadne auf Naxos for the sort of the rather easy dialogue. But Die Frau ohne Schatten seems to sort of span a wider period of time than just sort of the 15 years that Strauss had so far written operas. Actually, Richard Strauss referred to it as my last romantic opera, which I think is partly true. Certainly, the links to Wagner are strong. There's a repeating, there's one, for example, repeated falling line in the apparition scene that you just heard that that comes in throughout the score, and it has the same function as a leitmotif in Wagner. And whenever we hear that falling line, we remember the temptations that have been put in the way of the dyer's wife. But Strauss, of course, has his own voice. In Die Frau, this comes through in particular in the rather sort of unpleasant and feral scenes between Barak and his wife. The marriage is miserable, it's entirely dysfunctional, and it's caught in music that expresses depression, conflict, and hatred, in strong contrast to the lush beauties of the visions of the wife that are presented to the wife, I beg your pardon. Barak and his wife have a furious quarrel. They come close to murder. This is obviously a love-hate relationship. As many critics who saw this production say quite clearly, Strauss and Hofmannsthal knew what Freud knew, and Freud, of course, was one of their contemporaries, and they were living in Vienna at the same time. In fact, Strauss reveals himself, I think, in Die Frau ohne Schatten, at times to be a very, very realistic, naturalistic composer, rather in the same vein as the Italian Verismo composers. A lot of his music is strikingly modern, it's dissonant and disjunctive. It is the opposite of beautiful, and yet at the same time, the opera gains a tremendous amount of vitality by the contrast between beauty and dysfunction in the music.
Wie du's von Anfang nicht verstanden. Sonst sprechest du jetzt nicht von dir. Und diese Verse
the sharp contrasts in mood and atmosphere are the hallmark of Strauss as an opera composer. Those of you who are perhaps a little bit familiar with the drama of this time will see a sort of a strong Strindbergian element in this performance as well. But beauty, which is to a certain degree associated with decadence and self-indulgence, also in fact becomes an essential part of Hugo von Hofmannsthal and Richard Strauss's vision of the wholeness of a human being. In the scene that is just played, there was a moment where the wife was very strongly drawn to Barak, and then she broke away. She is actually the most divided of the characters in the action. In fact, she verges on schizophrenia at times. But there's a moment where she's drawn towards her husband, and we sense a quietness and a serenity coming over her. She actually is quite a complex character, not just an old harridan, but she really has sort of conflicting feelings within herself. And perhaps the main spine of the action of Die Frau ohne Schatten is to suggest how human beings can achieve a serenity. And when that serenity is revealed, it brings peace. And at the start of Act 3, Barak and his wife are separated by the higher powers, though we actually find in this condition, they find in this condition a surprisingly lonely one. And when they think of each other, a quieter sense of love and care develops. That as a duet occurs at the beginning of Act 3. And for the rest of the act until the end, they're like the two souls are in limbo. We hear them singing from different parts of the stage. We don't actually see them. We might even hear them singing from different parts of the opera house, as if they are sort of going through the world trying to find each other. And so Act 3 is essentially a discovery of what one actually is. Peace comes through the woman who is constantly on stage, but actually has so far rarely sung, the Empress. But as I said, she's the central role of the opera. She is the woman without a shadow. And in this production, she's actually on stage all the time as she watches the action. And through what she witnesses, she learns that love is not selfishness, is not pure desire, but is compassion, companionship, and having children. As a child of Kaikobad, she's a goddess, but by marrying a mortal man, she becomes half human. Her husband, the Empress, is actually the smallest of the major roles in the opera. It is a sort of a strange, lonely figure. In fact, both the Emperor and the Empress are figures of loneliness. And actually, as has been argued, and you're probably going to hear this from Professor Wolf, who I understand is delivering a lecture in San Francisco on June the 2nd about Die Frau, ohne Schatten and the Habsburgs, and I thoroughly recommend that you go to hear that. She was actually seen in some ways as being a reflection of or they were both seen as a reflection of the last major couple on the Habsburg throne. And in fact, several have seen the Empress as being essentially an embodiment of the legendary Sissi, or the Empress Elizabeth, who was one of the most popular, though one of the most sort of, in many ways, reserved of the final years of the royal government of the Habsburgs. Hofmannsthal, by the way, was a fervent believer in the Habsburgs. In 1919, they had they had just been dethroned, and so these two figures do, to a certain extent, have a certain nostalgic quality to them. The relationship between the Emperor and the Empress is enigmatic. They're infatuated with each other. They only cohabit at night. Of the day, the Empress is out hunting, and he returns each night to his lodge and to the Empress. And we never actually see them together until the very end of the opera, though we are very much convinced that they're enamored of each other, but there's a sort of a distance and a separation that in fact doesn't bring them together. We actually only see the Emperor 4 times. He has a big solo in Act 1 and a big solo in Act 2, and then we see him when he's been turned to stone, and finally he is actually released from the stone as his wife refuses to steal the shadow, but gets her own. And we see him emerge from stone, and then finally we see him singing with the Empress in the finale to the opera. The isolation of man and wife is perhaps as harmful as the vituperative marriage of Baruch and his wife. The Emperor, like his parallel in history, is a lonely figure. He's a character at odds with himself. Let me just play a very brief extract from his opening solo in Act 1, where he describes how he met his wife and how this has disturbed him despite his infatuation with her. And clearly he cannot fully understand or come to terms with the woman with whom he is deeply in love. She first appeared to him as a gazelle, but he captured her, and in doing so, she turned into a woman. He had been led to her by a falcon, and you heard that strange sort of screaming leitmotif on the high flute, and the falcon has been injured in this confrontation, and the falcon has left him. Now, it would take too much to go into the intricacies of the symbolism here, but it's as if the emperor has lost his innocence as well as the empress. Although the relationship between the emperor and the empress is not dwelt on as long as the relationship between Barak and his wife, it is central to the actual action of the opera. The characters don't sing as much, but their music is distinguished from the clatter and the mess of the world by the very high tessitura that both characters have. There's a sort of a Wagnerian breadth to their characters, and with the Empress, sort of ethereal melodies. The Empress initially sings little, but gradually she becomes more articulate as she realizes that taking Barak's wife's shadow will only aggravate her relationship with her own husband and increase her misery and increase the misery of Barak and his wife as well. And she also realizes that her misery is akin to that of Barak and his wife. At this point, she in fact determines to return to the realm of Kaikobad, and it's there that she sees her husband turn to stone. Here is that scene.
Frau
The Empress, I beg your pardon, I just lost my place. The Empress looks at, sees her husband turn to stone. And for the remainder of the opera, she works out her own feelings, and she realizes how, as we've already gathered from that bit of the solo we played, how she herself is like Barak, how she herself is an empress, but also is actually like other people. And so what she has to do is to become completely a human being. And this is what happens as we go through to the end of the opera. I'm afraid I don't have time to play the rather long trial scene, which has a very spectacular rituals going on and has some immense eruptions in the orchestra. But ultimately, she in fact accepts what it is to be fully human. And the ultimate definition of being fully human is to live by compassion. Live not only or not really to fulfill your own desires, but also, but in fact, to primarily adapt yourself to those of others. Now, Die Frau ohne Schatten is not the easiest of operas to understand. Certainly you will find that even though the plot is really simple, the massive sort of spectacular structure that you get in the opera sometimes tends to sort of swamp the plot and sort of hide its simplicity. But certainly there's a very elaborate Baroque action, and the symbols themselves are somewhat obscure. But oddly enough, this version of the opera that I have played, and which was actually sort of had very mixed reviews, I think clarifies the action quite considerably. And in particular, it emphasizes how psychologically perceptive Hofmannsthal libretto is. He deals essentially with emotional problems that are specific to his time, Vienna 1919, and not to some sort of general sort of sense of the past. The production at the San Francisco Opera that you're going to be seeing is one in which the action is fully played out and the spectacle fully developed. But I hope still that the sort of the actuality of the relationships come through. Now, just in conclusion, for some, this opera is somewhat archaic in its thinking. Some critics have insisted it says that the only function of women in this world is to have babies. And others, for example, I did read an article from a local writer in the San Francisco Chronicle who claimed that, in fact, Die Frau ohne Schatten is unfortunately on the wrong side of the abortion issue, and that essentially it's old-fashioned in this way because it argues that all life should flourish. But actually, I don't see that that is what the opera about is at all. I think these claims miss the point. It's helpful actually to see Die Frau ohne Schatten in its historical context. It was written during World War I, the war that depleted the population of Europe quite appallingly. So many young men were killed that it set European development back at least some decades. It's a war that grew out of the imperialist ambitions of several European countries. As a result of this, Europe, and Vienna in particular, was in deep depression. And added to this, of course, in 1919 were the ravages of the flu plague that also killed off many other people. I certainly don't think that Hofmannsthal, Richard Strauss had the issue of abortion in mind when they wrote Die Frau ohne Schatten. Rather, I think they were concerned about how do we revive a dying world? in the arts, in this, I think they wrote a very deeply personal story with wide references, both in the staging and the score, to earlier periods of the European arts and also the arts beyond Europe. And they placed a political coloring upon these characters, and it was that coloring that was probably recognized by audiences. But ultimately, I don't think this is an opera about the fall of Habsburg civilization, but a universal plea to change the world by saying that it is compassion for others that should rule everything that we do. And today, I think that is the message we need from the opera more than anything else. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to field any questions you might have.
Williams. Thank you so much, Professor Williams, for that fascinating, in-depth look at Frau, ohne Schatten. Hello to our virtual audience. My name is John Morris. I'm the Education Program Manager for the Opera Guild. We will now switch gears into our Q&A. We have had some questions come in for Professor Williams, so I am going to launch right in. In the San Francisco Opera press release, this was referred to as a bucket list opera. Why do you think that is, and what makes it a bucket list opera?
Actually, I've never been entirely sure what a bucket list is, but I think it means an opera that you really have to see.
Yes.
It is, let me put it this way. I think it's a very important opera. We hear the 19th century, we hear the 18th century, we sort of get a sense of sort of of history out of what is sort of primarily a sort of a domestic personal opera. But we get this sense of changing generations, and certainly in Barak and his wife, we get the sense of a modern world. That in itself is important because there are not a tremendous number of operas that actually do this as well as I think Strauss does. It's also a bucket opera because it's fantastically ambitious. I don't know whether it has the greatest number of instruments ever designed to be performed in an opera, but certainly it is one of the very, very largest orchestras. By the way, Wagner, I think, said there should be 112 instruments in the orchestra for Götterdämmerung. Well, in Die Frau, ohne Schatten, we have 164. But that in itself is sort of is remarkable, and also I like it. I actually really enjoy what I've just shown because it is actually so simple, but I do have to say I have seen one or two productions of Die Frau, ohne Schatten that really go to town on the spectacle, and it's such a joy to see that spectacle. Instead of having those dear ladies who we saw all in their winter clothes, and what you actually have is you have spirits sort of flying all over the stage. So, I mean, I suppose this is a bucket opera to the extent that you won't really have had a complete operatic career as your career as an audience member in opera probably will not have been complete unless you've seen Die Frau, ohne Schatten, because it's one of the largest and the most spectacular, and actually I have to say at times quite outrageous operas. You know, it goes to sort of extraordinary lengths, but it's immensely enjoyable.
Thank you. And speaking of spectacle and design and production, David Hockney is the designer for this production. And how do you think that his design and his art, lends itself well to this opera? Why is this, a good marriage?
He really focuses on the opposite of what Christoph Lloyd focused on in the extracts I showed. I mean, he really gives us the fairy tale. The sets, I just showed you a couple of pictures of them. They are quite entrancing. They are actually, interestingly enough, I think they're based upon the Hollywood Hills. I can remember when I was coming back from seeing it at the Los Angeles Opera, and we drove actually toward the Hollywood Hills, and I looked, I said, you know, that's the set that Hockney had in mind. That's the view he had in mind when he designed these sets. But there is actually a sort of, at least in LA, and I think possibly one will find it in San Francisco. There is rather, this is rather a Californian sort of situation. It's the landscape, which I find, having lived in California for a long time now, I find the landscape of California, it never fails to be magical and enchanting. And I think that Hockney gets that in the sets, which works well as a metaphor for the difference between the spirit world and the earth world in Die Frau ohne Schatten.
Absolutely. I loved when you mentioned the spiritual landscape of the magic flute
Yeah,
and the connection to this opera as well.
yeah,
And I personally think that that lends itself very well to opera because it's so imaginative
yes,
and it's so
yes,
epic.
yes.
And, with characters and the visuals and, of course, the beautiful music.
Mhm,
And,
mhm.
we can kind of experience that landscape just as the characters do.
Yes, yes, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It does need it does need a magical landscape. One of the productions that I referred to a little bit slightingly, perhaps I shouldn't have done, but you know, among the DVDs that were available, and I played it through, and most of the scenes on Earth happen in the laundry of a big block of apartment, a big apartment block, I think it is, and it just doesn't work. And in fact, I find seeing those characters on that sort of that platform, sort of struggling with their feelings to each other, was much more moving than seeing people sort of, sort of throwing the sheets into the washing machines and things like this, which is what they do in that production.
Interesting. Our next question is actually two-part. For a person who is unfamiliar with Strauss's operas, which opera is a good introduction? And then if you personally could only attend one more Strauss opera in your lifetime, which one would it be and why?
Wow, that's a good one. The best one to be introduced to? You know, the most accessible music, I think, is Ariadne of Naxos.
Mhm.
It's a wonderfully pleasing opera. It's very witty. It has lovely romantic passages. It doesn't, even though it's actually about the incompatibility of tragedy and comedy, in actuality, it's not a dissonant score at all. I find it, I love it because it's sort of so relaxing. If I had to see only one, I have in recent years become very, very much attached to his late operas, particularly to Arabella and to Capriccio. I think Capriccio is actually one of the, it's a major work, and it's astonishing that it was written when he was 79 years old, and it's the last opera that he wrote, and even though by that time Hofmannsthal had been dead for 16 years, the whole opera really does sort of resonate with his ideals as to how music is a sort of a humanizing force. So I think that one, and I would say this because I probably don't know it quite as well as I do know some of the other operas. I haven't seen everything by Richard Strauss. I'd love to see Die Liebe der Danae, which I've not seen, and there are a few others which I have heard on recordings and find very attractive. But I hope that's a good answer to the question. That's a challenging one.
That's a very good answer. And with that, just in the interest of time, I'm going to welcome Peggy Hill, Opera Previews Chair, back to the virtual stage. I will mention to our virtual audience, thank you again so much for joining us. And you can see the link in the chat, sfopera.com/opera previews. This will take you to the rest of the summer offerings that Peggy is going to reference. And also, this virtual preview is available to stream on demand through the run of De Frau ohne Schatten through June 28th. And so you can stream this recording, or others can stream it who were not able to join us this evening. Over to you, Peggy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it was fascinating. Thank you, Professor Williams. And hope you will all join us on Friday, June 2nd at 6 p.m. for Madame Butterfly. And Alexandra Amati will speak to us. And this is your only chance really for a preview, because there will be no in-person previews. But again, I know many of you do, when possible, prefer the in-person preview. So please check out the link, the website, go on it, and you can perhaps join one of the chapters throughout the Bay Area. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a lovely rest of the Tuesday evening. And again, thank you so much, John, for putting this all together, and Professor Williams. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.